Before we go any further, let me ask you something simple. If stories like this help you think a little deeper, consider subscribing not for volume or urgency, but so you don't miss the next question we explore together. The system worked exactly as it was supposed to. Procedures were followed, roles were respected, and the outcome aligned with every formal expectation placed upon it. On paper, there was nothing left to fix, and yet that sense of completeness never quite arrived. What lingered was not suspicion, but discomfort, quiet, unprovoked, and difficult to explain. People struggled to articulate why they felt unsettled, because the usual reasons were absent. There was no obvious error to point to, no visible failure to correct. The doubt that remained didn't accuse the system of wrongdoing. It questioned something else entirely. It questioned whether correctness alone is enough. Over time, it became clear that the doubt wasn't rooted in disagreement with the result, but in a subtle mismatch between process and experience. The system delivered an answer, but it didn't deliver understanding. This distinction mattered more than anyone expected. People realized they weren't doubting the decision itself. They were reacting to how it felt to live with it afterward. The absence of friction during the process made the lingering unease harder to dismiss. If nothing went wrong, why did something feel unresolved? This question didn't demand a reversal or a fix. It demanded reflection. The system had done its job, but it had also revealed its limits. It showed that systems are designed to decide, not to reconcile inner conflict. The doubt that remained wasn't evidence of failure. It was evidence of depth. It suggested that some forms of understanding exist outside procedural logic, emerging only when outcomes meet human expectation. As people sat with this realization, they noticed that doubt didn't weaken their trust in the system. It redirected it. Trust shifted away from expecting emotional satisfaction and toward accepting functional reliability. The system worked, but it didn't close the conversation. It opened a quieter one, asking individuals to confront what they expect from systems in the first place. This wasn't about fairness or injustice. It was about alignment, about the space between what works and what feels complete. And in that space, doubt didn't act as a threat. It acted as a signal, pointing not to what failed, but to what the system was never meant to resolve on its own. After the initial discomfort settled, people began to notice that doubt did not behave the way they expected. It didn't grow louder or more insistent. It didn't demand action or correction. Instead, it stayed quiet, present without pressure, asking to be acknowledged rather than solved. This was unfamiliar. Doubt is often treated as a problem to eliminate, a sign that something has gone wrong. But here, nothing had gone wrong. The system had functioned cleanly, efficiently, and within its intended boundaries. The lingering doubt wasn't pointing backward toward an error. It was pointing inward toward expectation. People realized they were grappling with a gap between how systems operate and how humans experience outcomes. The system had delivered clarity, but clarity didn't translate into ease. Living with the result required a different kind of adjustment, one that had nothing to do with rules or procedures. Over time, individuals stopped trying to silence the doubt and started listening to what it was actually saying. It wasn't questioning legitimacy. It was questioning completeness. The doubt asked whether it was reasonable to expect a system to provide emotional resolution and whether disappointment was a reaction to failure or to misplaced expectation. This reframing changed how doubt felt. It became less threatening and more instructive. People found that acknowledging the doubt reduced its intensity. It no longer hovered as an unresolved tension. It settled as a reminder of limits. The system had done what it could, and what remained belonged elsewhere. This recognition allowed individuals to separate trust from comfort. They could trust the system without needing it to make them feel whole. This distinction mattered because it preserved confidence, without forcing acceptance of emotional closure. The doubt that remained did not undermine participation. It refined it. People became more honest about what systems can and cannot provide, and in doing so, reduced the friction that arises when expectations exceed design. Living with doubt became an exercise in realism rather than suspicion. The case demonstrated that doubt does not always signal instability. Sometimes it signals maturity, the willingness to accept that not every outcome is meant to feel complete. By allowing doubt to exist without trying to resolve it prematurely, individuals found a steadier footing. The system worked. The doubt remained, and between the two, a more accurate understanding of responsibility began to take shape, one that acknowledged function without demanding fulfillment, and process without insisting on emotional resolution. As people began to live with doubt rather than push against it, they noticed a shift in how everyday judgments were made, quieter but more deliberate than before. Decisions that once demanded certainty were now approached with a different posture, one that allowed room for incomplete information without paralysis. The system's outcome had not removed responsibility. It had relocated it. Individuals realized that waiting for full emotional clarity before acting was no longer realistic, and perhaps never had been. Instead, they learned to move forward while keeping doubt in view, not as an obstacle but as context. This change altered the texture of choice. People paused longer, not out of fear, but out of attentiveness. They weighed consequences without expecting them to feel resolved in advance. The case had revealed that responsibility does not begin where certainty ends. It begins where uncertainty must be managed. This understanding reduced the impulse to overcorrect. Actions became less reactive and more measured, guided by alignment rather than reassurance. Over time, individuals discovered that doubt could coexist with decisiveness when expectations were adjusted. They stopped treating unresolved feeling as a signal to delay and started treating it as information to consider. The system had provided a boundary. Within that boundary, personal judgment took over. This handoff was subtle but significant. People felt less betrayed by outcomes and more accountable for how they responded to them. The doubt that remained did not demand withdrawal. It demanded care. Choices were made with an awareness that consequences would continue to unfold beyond the moment of decision. This awareness fostered humility. Individuals became more open to revision, more willing to learn from outcomes without framing them as confirmations or failures. The case showed that living with doubt is not about accepting confusion. It is about accepting responsibility without guarantees. When people stopped expecting decisions to feel complete, they found they could act more honestly. The system worked as a foundation, not as a shelter from complexity. And within that space, doubt became a companion to judgment rather than its enemy, shaping choices through restraint, patience, and a clearer understanding of what it means to act responsibly when certainty is not available. As this new way of choosing settled in, people began to notice how differently time behaved around unresolved outcomes. Moments no longer rushed toward emotional conclusions. They stretched, allowing reflection to catch up with action. The case had introduced a slower rhythm, one that resisted the urge to label experiences as finished. Simply because decisions had been made, individuals realized that outcomes often conclude processes, not experiences. Living with that distinction changed how they measured progress. Instead of asking whether something felt settled, they asked whether it remained workable. This shift reduced the pressure to force meaning too quickly. People accepted that understanding can lag behind action without invalidating it. The system had offered a framework, but time was doing the rest of the work. Over days and weeks, reactions softened not because answers appeared, but because perspective widened. What initially felt unresolved began to feel contextual. The case demonstrated that time does not resolve doubt by erasing it. It resolves it by integrating it into routine. Individuals found that the same question could feel heavy one day and manageable the next, without anything external changing. This taught a quiet lesson about patience. Emotional alignment cannot be scheduled, and demanding it prematurely often intensifies discomfort. By allowing time to operate without interference, people discovered that many tensions recalibrate on their own. The doubt that once occupied attention gradually receded into the background, not forgotten but proportioned. This proportionality mattered. It prevented the outcome from dominating thought while still informing it. The case showed that responsible living does not require constant engagement with unresolved meaning. It requires knowing when to engage and when to let experience accumulate. Over time, individuals trusted this process more. They stopped revisiting the same questions with urgency and began revisiting them with curiosity. This curiosity felt lighter, less burdened by the need to resolve. The system's role remained fixed, but the human response evolved, guided by the natural pacing of understanding rather than the demand for closure. In this way, time became an ally rather than an adversary, demonstrating that many doubts are not meant to be confronted head-on, but carried forward until their edges soften through continued living. The case did not teach people to wait passively. It taught them to move while allowing meaning to arrive at its own pace, reinforcing the idea that resolution is not always an event, but often a gradual accommodation shaped by time and experience. As time softened the sharp edges of doubt, people began to recognize another shift taking place, one that had less to do with answers and more to do with attention. The case no longer occupied the center of thought, yet it had not disappeared. Instead, it surfaced selectively, appearing when situations demanded judgment rather than when curiosity alone called for it. This change revealed how unresolved meaning can become functional without being intrusive. Individuals noticed they were less preoccupied with revisiting the outcome and more focused on how it informed present choices. The system had completed its role, but its influence persisted in the background, shaping awareness rather than demanding focus. This subtle presence altered how people listened, spoke, and paused. Conversations became more deliberate, Silence was tolerated longer. People felt less pressure to fill gaps with conclusions. The case demonstrated that attentiveness does not require constant analysis. It requires readiness. By not forcing interpretation, individuals preserved mental space for situations that truly needed reflection. This readiness fostered discernment. People became better at distinguishing between questions worth engaging and those that could remain open without consequence. The doubt that once felt heavy had become lighter, not because it was resolved, but because it was no longer competing for attention. This lightness did not signal indifference. It signaled integration. The case had been absorbed into a broader framework of understanding, one that allowed unresolved meaning to coexist with daily responsibility. Individuals trusted themselves to recognize when the case mattered and when it did not. This trust reduced cognitive strain. Decision-making felt steadier because it was no longer anchored to the need for emotional completion. The system's outcome provided structure, while lived experience supplied proportion. Over time, people realized that much of their earlier discomfort came from trying to hold every question at once. By releasing that impulse, they gained clarity without answers. The case showed that attention is a finite resource, and that responsible judgment involves allocating it wisely. Some questions deserve sustained focus. Others serve their purpose simply by being acknowledged. In this way, the case taught a practical lesson about living with uncertainty. Not every unresolved matter needs to remain active in thought to remain meaningful. When attention is guided by relevance rather than fixation, doubt becomes manageable, and understanding continues to develop quietly, shaping perception without overwhelming it. As attention settled into this more deliberate rhythm, people began to notice how expectation itself had quietly shifted. They no longer waited for decisions to deliver emotional alignment, nor did they interpret discomfort as evidence that something had gone wrong. The case had altered the baseline. Expectation moved away from satisfaction and toward reliability. Individuals realized that much of their earlier unease had come from assuming that systems should feel right, not simply function well. This assumption softened. People became more realistic about what outcomes can offer and what they cannot. The system had provided a result. Meaning had to be assembled elsewhere. This recognition reduced disappointment without diminishing engagement. People continued to care, but they cared differently. They no longer invested emotional energy in hoping for closure, and as a result, they felt less betrayed when closure did not arrive. The case demonstrated that expectation management is not about lowering standards, but about aligning them with design. Systems are built to decide, not to console. Once this distinction was accepted, participation felt steadier. Individuals approached future decisions with fewer hidden demands. They asked not whether an outcome would make them feel complete, but whether it would be workable and consistent. This reframing changed how people responded to ambiguity. Ambiguity was no longer treated as a flaw in the process, but as a natural condition of human experience. The case showed that when expectations are realistic, doubt loses its sharpness. It becomes a signal rather than a stressor. Over time, people found themselves less reactive to outcomes that failed to satisfy emotionally. They could acknowledge disappointment without turning it into distrust. This balance preserved confidence while allowing honesty. The system's credibility remained intact because it was no longer burdened with expectations it was never meant to fulfill. People learned to separate emotional needs from procedural outcomes, and in doing so, they reduced friction between themselves and the structures they relied on. The case revealed that much of the tension surrounding decisions arises not from what systems do, but from what people quietly hope they will do. By making those hopes visible and adjusting them, individuals reclaimed agency over their responses. Expectation became a choice rather than a demand. And within that choice, doubt found its proper place not as an accusation, but as a reminder to keep expectations grounded, engagement honest, and responsibility shared between systems that decide and people who must live with those decisions afterward. As expectations aligned more closely with reality, people began to sense a change in how responsibility was distributed between systems and individuals. The case had clarified a boundary that many had never consciously examined before. Systems could decide, but living with those decisions required something more personal. This realization shifted how people interpreted their own role after outcomes were delivered. Responsibility no longer ended when a process concluded. It began there. Individuals noticed they were less inclined to wait for permission to move forward emotionally or ethically. The system had spoken, but interpretation and response were now theirs. This handoff carried weight. It required people to engage more actively with their own values, rather than relying on institutional conclusions to do that work for them. The case demonstrated that responsibility does not disappear when authority acts. It transforms. People became more aware of how they chose to respond once structure was in place. Some found this empowering, others unsettling, but all recognized that the absence of emotional closure did not absolve them of agency. Over time, individuals learned to hold outcomes as facts rather than directives for feeling. This distinction mattered. It allowed them to acknowledge reality without surrendering autonomy. The system's decision defined what had happened, but it did not define what it meant to live responsibly afterward. This separation reduced resentment. People felt less compelled to blame systems for internal discomfort and more capable of addressing that discomfort directly. The case revealed that much frustration arises when responsibility is misassigned, when people expect systems to resolve conflicts that belong to personal conscience. By correcting this expectation, individuals reclaimed a sense of authorship over their responses. Responsibility became active rather than reactive. Choices were made with greater awareness of consequence, not because the system demanded it, but because individuals recognized their role in carrying meaning forward. This shift did not undermine trust in structure. It complemented it. Systems provided stability. Individuals provided interpretation. Together, they formed a workable balance. The case showed that when responsibility is shared appropriately, neither side is overburdened. Systems are free to operate within their limits, and individuals are free to engage with outcomes without waiting for resolution to be delivered from the outside. In this way, the lingering doubt found a constructive outlet, not in questioning authority, but in motivating thoughtful ownership of what followed. As people took ownership of what followed the decision, They began to notice how doubt quietly reshaped their sense of control. Control was no longer associated with certainty or prediction, but with adaptability. The case had shown that influence does not come from eliminating uncertainty, but from responding to it with awareness. Individuals felt less urgency to anticipate every consequence, and more confidence in their ability to adjust as consequences unfolded. This shift reduced anxiety without diminishing responsibility. People understood that control exercised too early often becomes rigidity, while control exercised too late turns into avoidance. The case revealed a middle ground, one where individuals could act decisively while remaining open to correction. This balance changed how people related to outcomes that deviated from expectation. Instead of treating deviation as disruption, they treated it as information. Each unexpected development became an opportunity to recalibrate rather than a reason to doubt the entire process. Over time, this approach fostered resilience. Individuals trusted themselves to navigate uncertainty without demanding guarantees in advance. The system had provided a stable framework, but personal agency determined how that framework was lived within. This distinction empowered people to engage more fully with their circumstances. They no longer waited for clarity to grant permission to move forward. They moved forward while staying attentive to what clarity might later reveal. The case demonstrated that control, when redefined as responsiveness rather than dominance, becomes sustainable. People stopped measuring their influence by how much they could predict and started measuring it by how well they could adjust. This reframing softened the fear associated with unresolved outcomes. Doubt lost its ability to paralyze because it was no longer mistaken for loss of control. Instead, it functioned as a signal to remain flexible. The case showed that when individuals accept uncertainty as a condition rather than a threat, they regain a sense of agency that does not depend on final answers. Control became quieter, less visible, but more reliable. It was expressed through readiness rather than certainty, through attentiveness rather than insistence. And in that form, control no longer competed with doubt. It worked alongside it, allowing people to remain engaged, responsible, and capable of navigating outcomes that did not arrive with emotional completion but still demanded thoughtful participation. As responsiveness replaced the need for certainty, people began to experience a quieter confidence, one that did not rely on reassurance or approval. This confidence was not loud or declarative. It showed itself in how individuals navigated moments that offered no clear guidance. The case had taught them that confidence does not come from knowing what will happen, but from trusting how one will respond when it does. This realization altered the internal dialogue that followed difficult decisions. Instead of replaying outcomes in search of validation, people assessed whether their actions aligned with their values at the time they were taken. The absence of guarantees no longer felt like exposure. It felt like honesty. Individuals recognized that demanding certainty before acting often masked a deeper reluctance to accept responsibility. For imperfect choices, the case reframed that reluctance. It showed that responsibility does not require perfect foresight, only sincere engagement. Over time, this understanding reduced self-reproach. People were less inclined to judge past decisions harshly when new information emerged. They learned to evaluate choices within the context in which they were made, rather than against outcomes that could not have been predicted. This approach fostered self-trust. Confidence became rooted in process rather than result. The system had modeled this distinction by operating consistently within its limits. Individuals mirrored it by holding themselves to standards of integrity rather than success. This parallel mattered. It created continuity between institutional reliability and personal accountability. The case demonstrated that when people stop measuring themselves by outcomes alone, they become more resilient to disappointment. They remain open to learning without turning reflection into punishment. This resilience did not diminish ambition or care. It refined them. Individuals continued to aim for good outcomes, but they no longer equated unfavorable results with personal failure. The case had quietly introduced a healthier metric for confidence, coherence over time. When actions reflected values consistently, confidence followed naturally, even in the presence of doubt. This shift allowed people to move forward without needing to resolve every question left behind. They carried uncertainty with composure, trusting that clarity, if it arrived, would be integrated without undoing what had already been done responsibly. In this way, the case completed another subtle transfer, moving confidence away from certainty and anchoring it in the steadier ground of engaged judgment, where doubt and assurance could coexist without canceling each other out. As confidence settled into this quieter, process-based form, people began to notice a shift in how they interpreted silence itself. Silence was no longer assumed to mean avoidance, denial, or weakness. Instead, it began to feel intentional, a pause chosen rather than imposed. The case had revealed that not every moment requires articulation, and not every unresolved feeling demands explanation. Individuals became more comfortable allowing silence to exist without rushing to fill it with justification or narrative. This comfort altered conversations. People spoke less to convince and more to clarify. They listened longer, recognizing that meaning often emerges in what is left unsaid. The system's restraint had modeled this behavior by concluding where it was meant to conclude and stopping there. That restraint echoed outward. Individuals learned that restraint is not the absence of engagement, but a form of discipline. It reflects an understanding of limits, both personal and structural. The case demonstrated that excessive explanation can sometimes obscure rather than illuminate, especially when explanation is driven by the need to soothe discomfort rather than to communicate truth. Over time, people felt less compelled to defend outcomes they had already accepted. Acceptance no longer required constant reaffirmation. This reduced emotional fatigue. Silence became a space for integration rather than a void demanding resolution. Individuals discovered that by allowing silence to exist, they created room for meaning to settle naturally. The case showed that clarity does not always arrive through more information, but through the alignment of experience over time. When people stopped pressing for immediate understanding, understanding began to form on its own terms. This did not eliminate questions, but it changed their tone. Questions became reflective rather than urgent, exploratory rather than accusatory. Silence held them without pressure. The system had done its work decisively and then stepped back. People learned to do the same. They recognize that knowing when to stop engaging is as important as knowing when to act. This awareness refined judgment. Individuals became less reactive to ambiguity and more selective about where they invested interpretive effort. Silence was no longer feared as emptiness. It was valued as space, and within that space, doubt softened. Confidence stabilized and understanding continued to evolve without being forced. The case illustrated that some of the most meaningful shifts occur not through action or explanation, but through the disciplined choice to pause, allowing what has already been decided to be lived with fully before being analyzed further. As silence became easier to hold, people noticed that their sense of judgment had begun to change shape, moving away from quick evaluation toward sustained awareness. They no longer rushed to categorize experiences as resolved or unresolved. Instead, they allowed situations to remain open long enough to reveal their true contours. The case had demonstrated that judgment sharpened too early often distorts what it seeks to understand. By waiting, individuals gained access to subtler insight. They observed how initial reactions softened, how assumptions loosened, and how meaning rearranged itself when given time. This patience did not weaken decisiveness, it refined it. When action was required, it emerged from a deeper place, informed by observation rather than impulse. The system's earlier restraint had shown that stopping at the right moment can preserve credibility. Individuals mirrored this by learning when to withhold judgment without abandoning responsibility. Over time, they became less invested in being right and more invested in being accurate. Accuracy required attention, and attention required time. The case revealed that many conflicts persist not because answers are unavailable, but because judgment arrives before understanding. By delaying evaluation, people reduced internal friction. They felt less compelled to defend positions that had not yet fully formed. This flexibility allowed beliefs to mature rather than harden. Individuals noticed that their internal narratives became less rigid, more responsive to context. They could revise without feeling inconsistent. The case demonstrated that coherence does not require fixed conclusions, only alignment over time. As this understanding settled, judgment transformed into a process rather than a verdict. People evaluated continuously, adjusting as new information or perspective emerged. This ongoing evaluation felt steadier than decisive finality. It allowed individuals to remain engaged without becoming entrenched. The system had closed its file responsibly. Individuals kept theirs open thoughtfully. This parallel revealed an important distinction. Institutions conclude to function. People reflect to live. The case taught that judgment, when practiced with patience, becomes a tool for orientation rather than a weapon for certainty. Individuals found that by resisting the urge to finalize meaning too quickly, they preserved openness without losing direction. In this way, silence and patience worked together, creating conditions where judgment could operate with humility and precision, acknowledging limits while still guiding action responsibly. In a world where understanding often arrives gradually rather than all at once, as judgment settled into this slower, more attentive form, people began to notice how their relationship with doubt itself had softened. Doubt was no longer treated as a temporary disturbance to be overcome, but as a stable companion that signaled when deeper consideration was needed. The case had shown that doubt does not always demand resolution. Sometimes it asks for accommodation. Individuals learn to recognize the difference. When doubt persisted, it was no longer met with frustration or urgency, but with curiosity about what it was pointing toward. This curiosity altered how people engaged with uncertainty. They stopped asking when doubt would disappear and started asking what it was, helping them notice. The system had modeled this approach by defining its limits clearly and not extending beyond them. People mirrored that restraint internally. They became less inclined to force clarity where none was available, and more willing to let understanding form through continued experience. Over time, this willingness reduced anxiety. Doubt lost its edge because it was no longer mistaken for danger. It became informational rather than threatening. Individuals trusted themselves to function effectively even when certainty was incomplete. This trust did not eliminate caution. It placed caution within a broader framework of responsiveness. People felt more comfortable adjusting their views as situations evolved, without interpreting change as inconsistency. The case demonstrated that stability and adaptability are not opposites, but partners. By allowing doubt to remain without demanding answers, individuals preserved openness while maintaining direction. This balance refined how they approached future decisions. Instead of waiting for confidence to arrive, they acted with awareness, knowing that confidence often follows engagement rather than preceding it. The system's reliability had provided a foundation. Personal adaptability completed the structure. As this integration deepened, people noticed that their internal landscape felt less crowded. There was less pressure to resolve every question immediately, less noise generated by unmet expectations. Doubt occupied less space precisely because it was given space to exist. The case revealed that some of the most durable forms of clarity emerge, not from eliminating uncertainty, but from learning how to carry it without resistance. In this way, doubt ceased to be an interruption and became a guide, quietly shaping attention and judgment without demanding finality, allowing individuals to remain engaged, responsive, and grounded even when answers remained out of reach. As doubt settled into its role as a guide rather than an obstacle, people began to recognize a deeper shift in how meaning itself was constructed. Meaning no longer arrived as a conclusion delivered from the outside. It formed gradually through interaction between experience and reflection. The case had disrupted the expectation that significance must be assigned immediately, showing instead that meaning often develops after outcomes have already been lived with. Individuals noticed that their understanding of the situation continued to evolve long after the decision was made, shaped by subsequent events, conversations, and personal growth. This ongoing construction felt more authentic than instant interpretation. It allowed meaning to remain responsive rather than fixed. The system had provided a definitive result, but it had not dictated interpretation, leaving space for individuals to assemble understanding in ways that reflected their own values and circumstances. This freedom changed how people related to past decisions. They no longer felt bound to a single interpretation formed at the moment of outcome. Instead, they allowed meaning to be revised as perspective expanded. The case demonstrated that revisiting understanding is not a sign of uncertainty, but of engagement. Individuals became more comfortable, acknowledging that what something meant yesterday might not be what it means today, and that this shift does not invalidate either perspective. This flexibility reduced internal conflict. People stopped defending earlier interpretations out of loyalty to consistency and started prioritizing accuracy as it evolved. Meaning became less about maintaining narrative coherence and more about remaining aligned with lived reality. The case revealed that when meaning is allowed to grow organically, it becomes more durable. It adapts without breaking. Over time, individuals trusted this process more. They felt less pressure to get it right immediately, and more confidence in their ability to understand things in stages. This staged understanding felt humane. It honored the complexity of experience without demanding premature clarity. The system had ended its role responsibly. Meaning continued elsewhere, shaped by time, context, and personal reflection. In this way, the case illustrated that meaning is not delivered by decisions, but cultivated through living with them. When people accepted this, they found relief from the expectation that understanding must be immediate and complete. Meaning became a process rather than a verdict, one that remained open to refinement without losing integrity, allowing individuals to engage deeply with outcomes without insisting that their significance be fixed at the moment they occur. As meaning continued to evolve through lived experience, people became more aware of how memory reshaped what they thought they understood. The case no longer existed as a fixed reference point. It lived as a sequence of recollections that shifted subtly over time. Individuals noticed that what they remembered most clearly was not the decision itself, but how they felt in the days and weeks that followed. Memory filtered details, softened edges, and emphasized moments that aligned with later insight. This process revealed that understanding is often reconstructed retrospectively, rather than captured at the moment it occurs. The system had recorded an outcome, but memory curated significance. People realized that their current interpretation of the case said as much about who they had become as it did about what had happened. This realization reduced the need to defend a single narrative. If meaning changes as people change, then revising interpretation becomes a sign of growth rather than inconsistency. The case demonstrated that memory is not an archive. It is an editor. It selects, reframes, and contextualizes events in ways that support ongoing identity. Individuals grew more attentive to this influence. They questioned not only what they remembered, but why certain aspects persisted while others faded. This questioning did not undermine trust in their experience. It refined it. People learned to treat memory as a conversation rather than a record, one that evolves as perspective deepens. The case showed that when memory is acknowledged as dynamic, individuals gain freedom from rigid interpretation. They no longer felt obligated to preserve the past exactly as it was first understood. Instead, they allowed it to inform the present without dictating it. This flexibility reduced emotional residue. Events lost their power to constrain when they were permitted to be reinterpreted. The system's role remained unchanged, but its presence in memory shifted continually, shaped by reflection rather than repetition. Over time, Individuals recognized that memory's purpose is not to preserve certainty, but to maintain continuity. It connects past experience to present understanding without freezing either. In this way, the case revealed another quiet truth: that the meaning people carry forward is not the meaning they received, but the meaning they reconstruct as they live on, allowing memory to serve not as a verdict on the past, but as a bridge between what happened and who they are becoming. As memory continued to reshape understanding, people began to recognize how identity quietly adjusted alongside it, responding not to facts alone, but to the meanings those facts had accumulated over time. The case had become less about what happened, and more about how individuals describe themselves in relation to it. People noticed subtle changes in the language they used internally. They no longer thought in terms of certainty or closure, but in terms of readiness and alignment. Identity felt less anchored to having answers and more grounded in how one carried unresolved questions. This shift did not weaken self-definition. It stabilized it. Individuals found that they could remain consistent without being rigid, allowing their sense of self to adapt as understanding evolved. The case demonstrated that identity does not depend on final conclusions, but on the ability to integrate experience without forcing it into fixed narratives. Over time, people felt less pressure to present themselves as resolved. They accepted that growth often appears as adjustment rather than transformation. This acceptance reduced internal conflict. Individuals stopped measuring integrity by how firmly they held beliefs and started measuring it by how honestly they revisited them. The case revealed that identity becomes more resilient when it is allowed to incorporate uncertainty without feeling threatened by it. People recognized that doubt did not erase who they were. It clarified how they engaged with the world. This recognition changed how they responded to challenge. Instead of defending identity through certainty, they expressed it through consistency of action. The system had modeled this approach by operating reliably within limits. Individuals mirrored it by remaining reliable within changing circumstances. This parallel reinforced self-trust. Identity became something practiced daily rather than asserted at moments of decision. As this understanding settled, people experienced a quieter confidence in who they were becoming. They no longer sought validation through outcomes or explanations. They trusted that coherence would emerge through continued engagement with life as it unfolded. The case had not defined them, but it had shaped how they defined themselves. It taught that identity, like meaning, is not delivered whole, but assembled over time through reflection, responsibility, and the willingness to remain open. In this way, the lingering questions left by the case did not undermine identity. They supported it, offering space for growth without demanding resolution, and allowing individuals to move forward grounded not in certainty, but in a steady sense of self that could adapt without losing direction. As identity adjusted to this steadier, less absolute form, people began to notice how their relationship with responsibility deepened in unexpected ways. Responsibility no longer felt like a burden imposed by outcomes, but like an ongoing practice shaped by attention and choice. The case had shown that responsibility does not begin and end with decisions made by systems. It continues in how individuals respond long after those decisions are finalized. People recognized that they could not outsource responsibility to process alone. Even when procedures were followed correctly, living ethically still required personal engagement. This realization did not produce guilt. It produced clarity. Individuals became more attentive to the small ways they influenced situations after outcomes had already been set. Responsibility appeared not in dramatic acts, but in restraint, patience, and follow-through. The case demonstrated that accountability is often quiet, expressed through consistency rather than reaction. People noticed they were less inclined to demand explanations from others and more inclined to examine how they themselves contributed to ongoing consequences. This inward turn did not diminish concern for fairness. It refined it. Responsibility became less about assigning fault and more about sustaining alignment between values and behavior over time. The system had provided a framework. Individuals provided continuity. Over time, this understanding reduced defensiveness. People felt less need to justify themselves through outcomes and more commitment to acting responsibly, regardless of how situations were perceived externally. The case revealed that responsibility gains strength when it is detached from validation. When individuals stopped seeking confirmation that they were right, they became more reliable in their actions. This reliability fostered trust, not because it resolved doubt, but because it demonstrated steadiness. Responsibility became something carried forward rather than something settled once. People accepted that some consequences unfold slowly and that ethical engagement requires patience. The case had not absolved anyone of uncertainty. It had taught them how to live responsibly within it. In this way, responsibility transformed from a reaction to events into a posture toward life itself, one that remained attentive without becoming heavy, committed without demanding certainty, and grounded not in final answers, but in the ongoing effort to act with care in situations where outcomes are already decided, but meaning and impact continue to evolve. As responsibility settled into this ongoing practice, people began to notice how it subtly influenced their sense of agency, not by expanding control, but by clarifying choice. Agency no longer felt like the power to change outcomes already decided. It felt like the capacity to respond with intention to what followed. The case had shown that freedom is not always about options, but about orientation. Individuals recognized that even when circumstances are fixed, their manner of engagement remains flexible. This realization shifted attention from what could no longer be altered to what could still be shaped. People became more deliberate about where they invested effort, emotion, and attention. They stopped exhausting themselves, trying to rewrite conclusions, and focused instead on how those conclusions lived on through behavior. The system had completed its role. Agency began where acceptance met action. This distinction reduced frustration. Individuals felt less trapped by finality and more capable within it. The case demonstrated that agency does not disappear when decisions are made. It changes form. It becomes quieter, more selective, and more enduring. People noticed that their influence was strongest not in moments of declaration, but in consistency over time. Small choices accumulated significance. How they listened, how they spoke, How they followed through mattered more than whether they agreed with the outcome. This awareness refined motivation. Individuals acted less from impulse and more from purpose. They understood that agency exercised responsibly does not seek to overturn reality, but to participate within it thoughtfully. Over time, this posture fostered a sense of steadiness. People felt less reactive to circumstances beyond their control and more engaged with those within reach. The case revealed that agency grounded in responsibility is resilient. It does not depend on winning or approval. It depends on alignment between intention and action. This alignment became a source of quiet confidence. Individuals trusted themselves to navigate what followed without needing to contest what had already been settled. The system's reliability provided boundaries. Personal agency filled the space inside them. In this way, the case illustrated that freedom and structure are not opposites. When structure is clear, agency can operate without confusion. People learned that acting responsibly within limits does not diminish autonomy. It gives it direction. And through this understanding, agency matured from a desire to control outcomes into a commitment to shape experience ethically and attentively, even when answers remained incomplete and decisions could no longer be changed. As agency matured into this quieter, intention-driven form, people began to notice how their relationship with expectation changed once again, this time at a deeper level. Expectations were no longer placed on outcomes, systems, or even on themselves to feel a certain way. Instead, expectations shifted toward conduct. The question stopped being, "What should happen?" and became, "How will I show up regardless of what happens?" The case had gradually redirected attention from results to presence. Individuals recognized that much of their earlier tension came from expecting experiences to confirm their internal narratives. When those confirmations failed to arrive, disappointment followed. By releasing that demand, people discovered a steadier footing. They no longer required events to validate their effort or justify their emotions. This shift did not lead to detachment. It led to consistency. People showed up with the same care whether situations felt meaningful or mundane. The case demonstrated that when expectation is anchored in behavior rather than outcome, engagement becomes sustainable. Individuals felt less drained by uncertainty because they were no longer negotiating with it. They accepted uncertainty as part of the environment, not as a verdict on their choices. Over time, this acceptance reshaped motivation. People acted because action aligned with who they were, not because they anticipated a particular resolution. The system's finality had once felt constraining. Now it felt neutral. It set boundaries without dictating inner experience. Within those boundaries, people exercised freedom through reliability. This reliability fostered trust, both internally and externally. Individuals trusted themselves to remain present even when situations offered no clear reward. The case revealed that expectation, when misdirected, amplifies doubt, but when redirected toward conduct, it stabilizes engagement. People became less reactive to perceived injustice or disappointment and more attentive to their own responses. This attentiveness did not eliminate feeling. It contextualized it. Emotions were acknowledged without being tasked with explaining or resolving anything. In this way, the case completed another quiet shift. moving expectation away from the future and grounding it in the present moment. What mattered was no longer what the system delivered or what doubt suggested, but how individuals chose to act within what had already been decided. And in that choice, they found a form of steadiness that did not depend on answers, outcomes, or closure, only on the ongoing commitment to show up with intention where certainty was no longer available. As intention replaced outcome as the center of expectation, people began to notice how this shift subtly changed their relationship with others. Interactions felt less transactional, less driven by the need for agreement or validation. The case had taught them that shared space does not require shared certainty. Individuals became more patient in conversation, less inclined to rush toward consensus or defend positions prematurely. Disagreement lost its edge because it was no longer perceived as a threat to coherence. People could remain aligned in purpose even when interpretations differed. This adjustment altered social rhythm. Discussions slowed, listening deepened, and responses became more measured. The case revealed that when individuals stop expecting outcomes to resolve emotional tension, they become more capable of holding space for one another. Presence replaced persuasion. People noticed they were less invested in winning arguments and more invested in understanding how others carried their uncertainty. This did not erase difference. It humanized it. Relationships felt steadier because they were no longer burdened with the task of producing resolution. The system had concluded decisively. Social life learned to continue without demanding that every interaction mirror that finality. Individuals found that trust grew not from agreement, but from consistency of conduct. Showing up with attention, restraint, and care mattered more than arriving at the same conclusions. The case demonstrated that community does not depend on shared answers, but on shared willingness to engage respectfully when answers diverge. Over time, this willingness softened social boundaries. People became more open to perspectives that once felt incompatible. They did not adopt them, but they accommodated them. This accommodation reduced friction without dissolving integrity. Individuals maintained their values while allowing others to maintain theirs. The case revealed that this balance is not passive. It requires intention. It requires choosing presence over certainty and respect over resolution. As this posture became more common, social environments felt less volatile. Differences existed, but they no longer dominated interaction. People learned to live alongside unresolved questions together, without needing to settle them before moving forward. In this way, the case extended its influence beyond individual reflection into shared experience, showing that when intention guides interaction, community can remain intact even in the absence of shared conclusions. What held people together was not clarity, but commitment to engage thoughtfully, to listen without urgency, and to remain connected without insisting that understanding be complete. As shared experience grew steadier without the pressure of agreement, people began to notice how this approach influenced the broader sense of continuity in their lives. Moments no longer felt fragmented by unresolved outcomes. Instead, they flowed into one another with less resistance. The case had shown that life does not pause for clarity, and that waiting for full understanding before moving forward often creates artificial breaks. By releasing the demand for resolution, individuals allowed experience to remain connected. This continuity reduced the feeling of being stuck between decisions and their aftermath. People recognize that meaning does not always arrive as a conclusion, but as an accumulation. Small moments layered over time began to carry weight. The system had delivered finality where it was required. Life continued elsewhere without insisting on emotional closure. This distinction reshaped how people approached long-term commitment. They became more comfortable investing energy in paths that did not promise immediate reassurance. Persistence replaced urgency. Individuals learned that staying engaged does not require certainty about where things will lead, only clarity about why they are moving forward. The case demonstrated that continuity is sustained not by answers, but by intention carried consistently over time. As this understanding settled, people felt less disrupted by unresolved questions resurfacing occasionally. These questions no longer threatened momentum. They accompanied it. Doubt appeared as a reminder of complexity rather than as a signal to stop. This reframing preserved motion without denial. People could acknowledge uncertainty without stepping out of their lives to resolve it. The case revealed that many forms of stability emerge not from decisive closure, but from the ability to keep moving thoughtfully. Continuity became a quiet achievement. It did not announce itself, but it was felt in the ease with which individuals transitioned between moments, responsibilities, and relationships. Life felt less interrupted by internal negotiation. The system's work had ended. Living continued. This separation allowed individuals to respect final decisions without letting them dominate their sense of direction. Over time, this posture fostered endurance. People trusted that understanding would deepen through participation rather than delay. The case illustrated that continuity is not maintained by certainty, but by the willingness to remain present across changing conditions. And in that presence, life regained its rhythm, moving forward not because questions had disappeared, but because they no longer demanded to be answered before the next step could be taken. As continuity settled into a natural rhythm, people began to notice how their relationship with reflection itself had changed. Reflection no longer arrived as an interruption that pulled them out of living. It moved alongside action, shaping awareness without slowing momentum. The case had shown that thinking deeply does not require stopping completely. Individuals learned to reflect while moving, adjusting perspective in real time rather than retreating into prolonged analysis. This integration altered how insight appeared. Instead of dramatic realizations, understanding emerged gradually, almost quietly, through repeated exposure to ordinary moments. People recognized that many of the most meaningful shifts happened without announcement. The system had concluded decisively. Reflection continued fluidly. This contrast taught a valuable lesson about proportion. Not every question deserves equal weight, and not every insight requires immediate articulation. Individuals became more selective about when to pause and when to proceed. This selectivity reduced mental noise. Reflection felt less heavy because it was no longer competing with the need to live fully. The case demonstrated that sustained awareness is more effective than episodic intensity. By keeping reflection close to experience, people avoided the cycle of overthinking followed by disengagement. They stayed present. Over time, this presence reshaped how lessons were absorbed. Instead of extracting meaning forcefully, individuals allowed it to form through repetition and context. The case revealed that understanding gained this way tends to endure because it is woven into behavior rather than stored as concept. People noticed that they no longer revisited the case deliberately. It surfaced naturally when relevant and receded when not. This responsiveness felt efficient and humane. Reflection became a resource rather than a demand. The system's role remained fixed in record. Its influence in thought became flexible. Individuals trusted themselves to recognize when deeper consideration was needed and when it could wait. This trust reduced anxiety around missing something important. They understood that insight does not disappear if it is not captured immediately. It returns when conditions are right. The case illustrated that reflective living does not mean constant introspection, but sustained attentiveness to how experience unfolds. In this way, reflection and continuity ceased to compete. They supported one another, allowing individuals to move forward without leaving understanding behind, and to deepen awareness without stepping out of life's ongoing flow. As reflection blended more seamlessly with daily movement, people began to recognize a quieter form of closure taking shape, one that did not announce itself as an ending but as a settling. Closure no longer arrived through explanation or agreement. It appeared through familiarity. The case had become something people knew how to carry, rather than something they needed to solve. This shift was subtle, but it changed how unresolved questions felt. They no longer hovered with urgency or demanded attention. They rested, present but proportioned, integrated into the broader texture of experience. Individuals realized that closure does not always mean having fewer questions. Sometimes it means having questions that no longer disrupt living. The system had closed the file formally. Life closed it practically. This practical closure emerged through repetition, through returning to ordinary responsibilities, and discovering that they could be handled without revisiting the outcome each time. People found that they no longer measured progress by emotional certainty, but by functional ease. If life could continue without friction, closure had likely arrived even if answers had not. The case demonstrated that many endings are lived rather than declared. They happen when attention naturally shifts forward, and the past no longer pulls focus backward. This understanding relieved pressure. Individuals stopped waiting for a moment when everything would feel resolved and accepted that resolution often looks like normalcy. Over time, this acceptance softened the need to revisit old doubts. The doubts had not disappeared. They had lost their authority to interrupt. People trusted that if a question truly mattered, it would resurface when relevant. Until then, it could remain at rest. The case revealed that closure achieved this way is resilient. It does not depend on narrative or explanation. It depends on the ability to move on without denial. Individuals learned that carrying something lightly does not mean dismissing it. It means allowing it to occupy its appropriate place. The system's decision remained unchanged, but its presence in daily thought diminished naturally. This diminishing did not signal forgetting. It signaled integration. Closure arrived not as a final statement, but as a state of ease. And in that ease, people recognized that some stories do not end when questions are answered, but when those questions stop interfering with the act of living, allowing experience to continue uninterrupted, grounded in acceptance rather than certainty. As this quiet sense of closure settled in, people began to realize that what remained was not an answer, but a changed way of noticing the world around them. Situations that once demanded certainty were now approached with a calmer awareness of limits. The case had not taught them what to think. It had taught them how to pay attention. Individuals found themselves less reactive to ambiguity in everyday life, less inclined to interpret uncertainty as a problem needing immediate resolution. Instead, they observed it as part of the landscape, something to move through rather than remove. This shift altered how expectations formed. People no longer assumed that clarity was the default state or that confusion signaled failure. They accepted fluctuation as normal. The system had delivered a clear endpoint. Living beyond it required adaptability. Over time, individuals noticed that their tolerance for complexity had increased. They could hold multiple interpretations without feeling the need to collapse them into one. This capacity did not produce detachment. It produced steadiness. People engaged with situations more thoughtfully because they were no longer rushing toward conclusions. The case demonstrated that attention sharpened when it was not driven by urgency. By slowing down interpretation, individuals perceived nuance they might have missed before. This awareness carried forward into unrelated areas of life. Decisions felt less dramatic, conversations less charged, outcomes less final. The case revealed that when people stop demanding certainty, they gain sensitivity. They notice context, timing, and proportion. Small details mattered more because they were no longer overshadowed by the pressure to decide immediately. Over time, this sensitivity fostered humility. Individuals recognized that many situations do not resolve cleanly, and that forcing resolution often distorts understanding. They learned to leave room for revision without seeing it as weakness. The system's firmness had shown one side of decision-making. Lived experience revealed the other. Together, they formed a balanced perspective. People trusted structures to do what they were designed to do and trusted themselves to navigate what followed. This dual trust reduced friction between expectation and reality. Life felt less adversarial, less like a series of problems to solve. The case had not simplified the world. It had made it more navigable. By changing how people noticed uncertainty, it allowed them to move through it with less resistance, carrying forward not answers, but a steadier awareness that made unanswered questions easier to live alongside. As everything settled into place, it became clear that what truly remained from this story was not a conclusion, but a shift in how people related to certainty itself. The system had worked. The process had been followed. The outcome had been delivered exactly as designed. And yet, the most lasting effect was not the decision, but the awareness it left behind. People learned that doubt does not always signal failure, and that silence does not always hide something broken. Sometimes, what lingers is simply the part of experience that no system is meant to resolve. This realization changed how individuals moved forward. They stopped waiting for life to feel complete before engaging with it. They acted with care instead of certainty, with attention instead of urgency. The case showed that justice can end a matter without ending its meaning, and that this is not a weakness, but a boundary, a necessary one, meaning people discovered does not arrive fully formed at the moment decisions are made. It arrives later, through living, through reflection, through the quiet accumulation of experience. The unanswered questions did not demand solutions anymore. They served as reminders of complexity, of humility, of the limits of structure and the responsibility of individuals beyond it. In that sense, the doubt that remained was not something to get rid of. It was something to carry thoughtfully. And perhaps that is where this story truly ends. Not with certainty, not with closure, but with awareness. Awareness that some systems exist to decide, not to comfort. That some answers are sufficient without being satisfying. And that learning to live with what remains unsaid may be one of the most honest forms of understanding we have. Before you leave, take a moment and think about this. Has there ever been a situation in your life where everything worked as it should, but something still felt unresolved? If so, I'd genuinely like to hear how you made sense of it. Share your thoughts in the comments not because there's a right answer, but because these questions are often clearer when we explore them together.